Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Mitchell First, who is an attorney as well as the author of a number of books. The first one being Jewish History and Conflict about Seder Olam. The second one being titled Roots. There's
Esther
one.
Unmasked.
Sorry, Esther Unmasked. There's Roots and Rituals, links to our legacy, and words for the why. So a number of books. The Roots, links, words, and I think Esther are all published by Kodesh Press. And the first one is like Aronson or something else. Now it's quite expensive now. But the point is that here for this episode we'll be discussing Aleinu, and being that it's almost Rosh Hashanah, this is a Rosh Hashanah oriented episode. It's something that Mitchell's written a bit about, which is about was Aleinu originally composed for Rosh Hashanah davening, or was it for weekday davening, and it ended up in Rosh Hashanah davening? The meaning of some of the words, geniza fragments, and various assorted things associated with Aleinu. So thank you, Mitchell, for joining me once again.
My pleasure.
So let's start off with, how did you become interested in Aleinu? Your book, Esther Unmasked, has a lengthy article in there. In Roots, there's a piece on it. You have some other things written on it. You've written pretty extensively about Aleinu.
So, I remember wondering as a child what this daily prayer was doing in the middle of the Shemona Esrei on Rosh Hashanah. Someone else in my community tells the story of how, as a child, he put down his machzor when he saw Aleinu in the middle of the Shemona Esrei because he thought his machzor was defective. And when he picked up the other machzors, he thought they were all defective. Of course, the real question is how this Rosh Hashanah prayer entered into the daily service, and that's what we're going to talk a lot about. So, about 20 years ago, I had the idea of writing a comprehensive article about Aleinu, and I did all this research, but the project just became too massive, so I put it on hold. But in 2009, my friend Yechiel Levy, who has a Yemenite background, he decided to show me his Yemenite siddur to see what interesting variants I would find. And I saw it had LeSaken Olam with a Chof, which means establish a world, not fix the world. And I had seen this spelling before in the siddur of Rav Sadia, but its importance did not register with me at the time. But this time I realized that the different spelling was very significant. And because I had all this information on Aleinu, I could easily do the research on this narrow issue of the spelling of LeSaken, so that's what I focused on. I was able to cite Rav Sadia, Rambam, and about 4 geniza fragments with the Chof reading, and that became an article in Chakira in 2011. Then I did much more research on the geniza material, and an improved version of my Aleinu article was published in Sfarim Blog 2013 and in my Esther book in 2015. Now, Professor Reuven Kimmelman of Brandeis has a very important book coming out soon on all the daily liturgy. I'll talk more about it soon, but he has a chapter on Aleinu, which is the comprehensive article that we all need, and I have been able to read that chapter even though the book is not out yet. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is how Aleinu moved into the daily Shachris.
So I want to stop. I want to jump in for a second. As you've been saying, like how it moved to daily Shachris and then Mincha Maariv. So you're going with the assumption that, and I maybe want to explain this first, I think, before I end up there, so that it was composed originally for Rosh Hashanah rather than vice versa.
Well, I will address that in like 15 minutes, but I want to just do this way first because we have more sources. I don't want to do too much speculation at the beginning. So I want to let's just make the reasonable assumption that it was a Rosh Hashanah prayer, and then I'm asking now how it got into Shachris. But I'll address the more fundamental questions in a few minutes. I just want to do it this way because I have clear sources as opposed to too much speculation. Okay. So again, I want to know, let's assume it's a Rosh Hashanah prayer. When and why did it enter the daily Shachris? So the basic answer is that we do have a manuscript of Machzor Vitri from the 12th century with Aleinu at the end of daily Shachris. Okay, 12th century Machzor Vitri, but it does not give the reason. Now, Vitry is a town in France, and Machzor Vitri was authored by a student of Rashi. This manuscript is called Sassoon 535, but actually someone bought it from Mr. Sassoon, but he wants to remain anonymous, so you're supposed to call it Ex Sassoon 535, but I might not be that makpid here. Okay, so we have this 12th century manuscript, of Machzor Vitri, But the question is, can we be more precise with our dating of the manuscript? And there's a reason that this is important. Why is this important? Because something happened in the city of Blois, Blois, which is in France, in 1171. So what happened in Blois in 1171? The Jews of the town were accused of murdering a Christian child, and as a punishment, around 30 men, women, and children were burned to death. And there are witnesses that they sang Aleinu as they were dying. So there's an idea in scholarship, a suggestion is made that perhaps it was this event of 1171 that led to Aleinu being considered an important prayer and becoming part of the daily Shachris. So in order to see if this suggestion is true, we have to date this ex-Sassoon manuscript more precisely. And it turns out that we can, and we can reject this 1171 suggestion. So now I'm going to explain how were they able to date this manuscript more precisely. So many of us have memories of the Birnbaum Machzor with calendars at the back, right? That kept us entertained in shul as kids. So it turns out that this Sassoon manuscript, this 535, had calendars attached to it too. Now, again, this is a 12th century manuscript, and the calendars, many of the pages are missing, and some are ripped. But basically, two scholars in 2015, Sasha Stern and Justine Isserlis, they wrote an article in a journal called Aleph in volume 15, and they analyzed the ripped calendar pages from this Sassoon 535 manuscript, and they were able to conclude that the manuscript dates from between 1123 to 1155. Okay, so basically, because we have these ripped calendars, that's enough of a clue. So we now can date this Machzor Vitry manuscript, and we can decide that it precedes the event of 1171. Okay, so again, our Machzor Vitry mentioned daily Aleinu and Shachris, but did not give the reason. But now we're going to move to Germany. We're going to talk about a work called Sidur Hasidei Ashkenaz, which is a work that reflects the prayer service of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. He's a leader of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, he was living in Germany. He died in 1217. So we're now like a few decades after Machzor Vitry, and now we're in a nearby country, Germany. So if you look in Sidur Hasidei Ashkenaz, they actually mention the reason for daily Aleinu. We're talking about Shachris, but they do give a reason. It's like a 4-word reason. They say, because it has Azkarat Hashem and Yichud Hashem. Now, we don't really know what Azkarat Hashem means, mention of God's name. It could be some gematria, some kind of letter pattern. But the other phrase, we do know what that means, Yichud Hashem, because it has Yichud Hashem. So what is Yichud Hashem? That's God's uniqueness. And what that is, you see, Hasidei Ashkenaz, that is a community where they wrote the Shir HaYichud, which is a piyut. They wrote it to be recited every day. We recite it only on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. But in this community, Hasidei Ashkenaz, this was an important theme to them, the Yichud Hashem, God's uniqueness, however you define it, okay? And this Shir HaYichud was written by Rabbi Yehuda Chassid or his father Shmuel. But the point is that in a community where Yichud Hashem is an important concept, so they're saying that's why they brought in Aleinu, because Aleinu has Hu Elokeinu Ein Od, so it's a perfect match to a community which values this idea of Yichud Hashem. So the only thing is that I'm very suspicious, because basically Germany is next to France, and we're now just a few decades after the Machzor Vitry manuscript. So I think that Aleinu started in France for unknown reasons, and then spread to Germany. And then what they're doing here in Sidur Hasidei Ashkenaz, they're just kind of rationalizing the existence of Aleinu in the daily davening, just to fit it into their philosophic approach to life. But I really think, I don't think it really started because of this idea of Azkarat Hashem v'Yichud Hashem. But I could be wrong. But this is what my intuition tells me. But okay, everybody is free to disagree with me. Okay, so we've now spoken about Aleinu in France, where we don't have the reason. We have Hasidei Ashkenaz in Germany a bit later, where they do give a purported reason. But now we're going to move to nearby England. So now this is really very interesting. We're going to learn about Aleinu in daily Shachris in England. Another early manuscript which does not have a date, but we're going to use a very interesting method of giving it a date. Okay, so this is a siddur from a siddur from England, and from the binding, they can decide that it was composed in England. Okay, so but it does not have a date. But so what is the interesting method that we're going to talk about now? You see, blank pages of siddur, there are always blank pages at the end of a siddur. So this one has notations in Judeo-Arabic. And what does that mean? See, a Sephardic businessman came to England, and he wrote down the names of the people who he collected payments from. Okay, I took payment from this one, that one, that one, and all these people that he took payments from, they were all important people. So nowadays, someone went and did the effort to try to track them down, and then they figured out that one of these people died in 1202. So if our Sephardic businessman took a payment from somebody who died in 1202, so we see that this siddur must have been in use prior to 1202. So all right, so basically, I discussed France and Germany. So now even in England, they were saying Aleinu at the end of daily Shachris, by 1202, and this manuscript is called Corpus Christi College 133. In one of my books, I think it's in the links book, page 217. I give the citation if you want to read want to read more about the person who studied these payment notations. That's in a book by Malachi Beit Ari, again, which I think it's in my links book, page 217. I give you the full citation. Okay, so we're finished with France, Germany, and England, but now we're going to go hundreds of miles away to a different part of the planet. And we're going to talk about another Aleinu in Shachrit, but not at the end of daily Shachrit. We're going to talk about Aleinu. This is something else. And okay, geniza. We have all these fragments of the siddur from the geniza. So we're talking about 1100s, 1200s. So there's one fragment. This is in a book by Fleischer, Tefillah Uminhagei Tefillah, page 238. So Ezra Fleischer found a fragment from the geniza, a siddur fragment, a Shachrit fragment from the geniza, where Aleinu was located in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra. Okay, so when I first ran into this, I thought this was really weird. Like, what is Aleinu doing in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra? And then I was talking to my friend, Rabbi Moshe Yazger, and he thought about it for 6 seconds, and he said, what do you mean it's a perfect fit? Because Aleinu l'shabeach. So what is Pesukei de Zimra? Has Tish B'chot at the beginning. It has the Tish B'chot Yishtabach at the end. So Aleinu l'shabeach is a perfect fit for Pesukei de Zimra. So even though when people talk about Aleinu in the daily Shachris, normally they're talking about the France, Germany, and England, but now we're talking about, we have something else where Aleinu was in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra from this fragment that Fleischer quotes from the geniza, was probably from the 1100s or the 1200s. But now I'm going to give you another related source, and this is really also very interesting. So if you look in the Rishonim, like the Kolbo and others, they quote from Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, they quote something about Aleinu. Okay, and they say Aleinu is an important prayer. L'chach tzarich la'omro ma'umad. That's why you have to say it standing. So we all read this and say, okay, fine, you have to say Aleinu standing. But now they quote this in Perkei Rabbi Eliezer. Now, it's not in Perkei Rabbi Eliezer today. Okay, I'm granted it's not in Perkei Rabbi Eliezer today, but let's assume that it really was in Perkei Rabbi Eliezer once. Perkei Rabbi Eliezer is a work from Israel from the 8th century. Okay, so now it would seem from Perkei Rabbi Eliezer that they were saying Aleinu daily, because when it says Tzarich la'omro ma'ubad, it's not talking about Rosh Hashanah. It's not talking about the Rosh Hashanah Amida, which you already have to be standing. It's not talking about Chazar Shas. It says Tzarich la'omro. So what I'm suggesting here is maybe this Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, in the 8th century Israel, is referring to that Pesukei de Zimra minhag that I just referred to from the 1200s. Now, again, we have this geniza fragment which shows that they were saying Aleinu in Israel or Egypt in Pesukei de Zimra in 1200s. Now I'm just trying to make some sense of this earlier statement, which presumably was once in Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, where they're referring to a daily Aleinu, and it says Tzarich la'omro ma'umad. So I'm just guessing maybe that's this Pesukei de Zimra minhag, or maybe it's something else. But in general, people don't even realize that there's a question here because so. This is just something to think about. Okay. Now, now I have to explain a little more about when Aleinu moved to daily Shachris. See, Aleinu is the introduction to Malchiyos. It's the introduction to 10 Malchiyos verses. So what we do today, we say verses 1 and 9 as our regular daily Aleinu. When I say Aleinu, I mean Aleinu and Elken Kava. So when we say Aleinu every day today, we say Hashem Yimlochi Elam Va'ed, and then we say the verse for Netmar at the end. So we have taken verse 1 and 9 also into the daily liturgy. But when Aleinu first entered the mfirstatty, it did not have either of those verses. Okay, so it just ended. Right, it ended So if you look at that mfirstatty, that's where it ended. It also ended that way in the Rokeach. So basically, that when Aleinu was first introduced, it did not have those two psukim that we have today. Like I was always wondering, why do we have 1 and 9? So the answer is it's a complicated 2-stage process. So basically, at some early point, they added that's already in that English manuscript from 1202. So in other words, that first sentence, which it's 6, I think was added for some gematria reason. It's like 6 words, and I think that adding 6 words kind of helped certain gematria, but no one knows exactly if that's the reason. But then the V'ne'amar from Zechariah, that wasn't added for several hundred years later. Okay, so this is just something to realize, that even though we're looking at the Aleinu today, which it has verses 1 and 9, but it was a 2-stage process, and first was step 1, that first verse, and then several hundred years later, they added the verse in Zechariah. Okay. So now, all right. So now I'm going to talk about the authorship of Aleinu.
So Misha, I want to jump in before.
Yeah.
So you've outlined very nicely for the listeners. Like basically, like you're saying, the question is in reverse. I had asked you, where it's for. You're, assuming that it was for daily, or maybe not. You're saying the question is, or the assumption is the other way, that it was for Malchiyos, it was for Rosh Hashanah. That's what it's about, and it got moved to daily davening. And you went through the history of it. So before we get to the authorship of Aleinu, do we know a 2-part question? Why? I'm saying just to emphasize why was it moved to Shachris? Do we have any idea? You talked about when. Why was it moved? And also, when did it end up in Mincha Maariv?
So I'm going to address. I'm going to address all those questions, just that I kind of need to follow the order that I planned out. Okay. And so the answer to your Shachris question is we don't really know. But I will make a suggestion at the end, okay? But again, mfirstatty does not give a reason, so the only thing I can do, I do intend to make a suggestion. You just let me. I'll get to it. That's all, okay?
Okay.
And I'm going to talk about Mincha Maariv at the end too. Okay. So, all right. So now, regarding the authorship of Aleinu, so Rabbi Yehuda Chassid is the first one to say that Yehoshua wrote Aleinu. Okay, but that's just a suggestion he made. It's not a tradition, and it can't be correct. Okay, because the language of Aleinu is the Hebrew of the Tannaitic and Amoraic period. For example, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that's not a Tanakh. That's early rabbinic Hebrew, and there are terms like Moshav, Yikaro, Shechinat, Uzo. Those terms are from the Tannaitic and Amoraic periods. And Olam, LeSaken Olam, Olam did not mean world. In the Chumash or in the time of Yoshua, that's only a later meaning of Olam, world. And of course, Aleinu cites verses from Yeshaya, which we're going to talk about too. So, anybody who studies the language of Aleinu realizes that it can't possibly be, from the time of Yoshua. Okay. By the way, I do have to mention also that the Art Scroll Siddur says that Hai Gaon, who's earlier than Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, Art Scroll Siddur says that Hai Gaon, somewhere in a tshuva, says that Yehoshua wrote Aleinu, but a scholar named Elliot Wilson, he's shown that was a later addition to the tshuva, that was not really in the original tshuva. Okay, so in general, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid is the first real source to say it, and everybody copies him afterwards. But again, the language is much later.
So that's Rabbi Yehuda Chassid and Sefer Chassidim.
It's he said it. No, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. It's in Siddur Chasidei Ashkenaz. Siddur Chasidei.
Okay, so just to clarify that, it's Siddur Chasidei Ashkenaz. Which, by the way, I would mention the Machzor Eitzer Rishonim from the Holzer family has a lot of that.
And it's put together by his students. Put together by his students. Nobody really knows, did he write those every word or did his students write it? But, okay, but that's, so the Hoshua idea is in that Siddur Hasidei Ashkenaz. Okay, just 1 second. All right. But so now I'm going to talk about who did author Aleinu. Okay, I said the language is from the Tannaitic or Amoraic period. Now, so Aleinu is not in the Gemara, but I'm going to make the argument that our early Amora Rav authored it. Okay, now how am I going to do that if it's not in the Gemara, right? So this, you'll see it's very interesting. So Rav, lived in the 3rd century, first in Eretz Israel, then in Bavel. So how am I gonna make this argument? Okay, so Aleinu probably originated as an introduction to the Malchiyos verses on Rosh Hashanah, like we do today. Again, I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So, but let's just Aleinu. So Aleinu originated as the introduction to the Malchiyos verses on Rosh Hashanah, right? Now, the Talmud Yerushalmi does not refer to the Malchiyos verses, but refers to the Zichronos verses. Now, the Talmud Yerushalmi is in 2 passages. It's in the Rosh Hashanah 1st chapter and in the Avodah Zarah 1st chapter. So, and when the Talmud Yerushalmi refers to the intro to Zichronos, it quotes a portion of the intro to Zichronos. And how does it call this section? What does it call it? It calls it Tkiyasa de Rav. Okay, there's another place it calls it Tkiyasa de Beirav. But the point is, when you look at the Talmud Yerushalmi in the 1st chapter of Rosh Hashanah and in Avodah Zarah, you see from their sugya, what they're saying is they are assuming that Rav wrote the intro to Zichronos. Okay, that's what you could see from these sugyas. So, but now it's very interesting. They don't call and then they quote a portion from the intro to Zichronos. Okay, now they don't call the prayer Zichronos of Rav. They call it Tkiyasa de Rav. Okay, so what that means to me, and I think to a lot of people who, if you really think about it, they're saying something broader. They're not just saying Rav wrote Zichronos. They're saying he wrote all 3 intros. And there was if they were just talking about the intro to Zichronos, they would have said the Zichronasa de Rav, but they say the Tkiyasa de Rav. Okay, so the implication of this is that Rav wrote all 3 intros. Okay, so if I've convinced you that Rav wrote all 3 intros, so then the question is, well, are the intros of the Talmud of the Talmud Yerushalmi, are they the same as the ones we have today? So that's the fundamental question, which we can't prove, but I can make suggestions. So the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's 2 sugyas. So one is in Rosh Hashanah, one is in Avodah Zarah, but one of them quotes more than the other. So they quote maybe 30 words from the intro to Zichronos, and that even though maybe that's only 15-20% of what we have today, but it does match what we have today. So I'm saying, a reasonable assumption is to say, well, if that portion of the intro to Zichronos is the same, then maybe the rest of the Zichronos were the same. Maybe the rest of the intro to Zichronos were the same. And if the entire intro to Zichronos was the same, then maybe the entire intro to Malchiyos was the same. So basically, and the reason I think that's a reasonable suggestion is because I don't think these intros were mix and match, where, well, you could have one intro to Zichronos, but you could have a different intro to Malchiyos. But I think whoever wrote the intro to Zichronos had a certain intro to Malchiyos in mind. So they're trying to supplement each other. So to me, I think it's a reasonable assumption that from the limited intro to Zichronos, we can assume that their entire intro to Zichronos was the same. And I think it's a reasonable assumption that their entire intro to Malchiyos is the same. Okay, so if you have those reasonable assumptions, then you can conclude that Rav was the author of Aleinu, which was the intro to Malchiyos. Now, did Rav know any Christians? That's unlikely because he was living in Eretz Israel and Bavel, and Christianity was not a major religion yet. Okay, now I'm going to tell you. So you've heard my view. Now I'm going to tell you what Professor Kimmelman says. So Professor Reuven Kimmelman, he has a book coming out soon, The Rhetoric of the Jewish Liturgy, on all the daily prayer. Nachi, you got to get him on a podcast, okay? So
The book's been coming out for a long time.
So,
by the way, Mitchell, I want to say the book
for a long time. We're getting
it's been years. It keeps saying coming soon, coming soon, coming soon. But I think you're saying now it's really coming soon.
It's really coming soon, right? It's really coming soon. Okay, all right. So he has a chapter, on Birkas Shachar, Psukei Zimra, et cetera. So one of his chapters is on Aleinu, and he has a certain interesting find. So he said he writes about an Aramaic piyut from the 4th century by a Samaritan poet named Marka. Okay, an Aramaic piyut from the 4th century, by a Samaritan poet. And how does it start? It starts Havlan Mishabcha Lamara Da'alma, which let us give Shevach to the Mara Da'alma. So, which is essentially the same phrase as Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol. So he finds this, which sounds like our Aleinu. Of course, it's in Aramaic, and then he has to decide: did this precede our Aleinu, or was it after our Aleinu? So he concludes that this Aramaic preceded our Aleinu, and then he dates Aleinu to the 5th century. Okay, so basically, I'm giving you, my view and Professor Kilman's view, but the point is, we're agreeing in that we're talking about a prayer that was composed, in the Tannaitic Aramaic period, not in Bayit Sheni, not in Bayit Rishon, et cetera, and not in the Golan. We're just kind of narrowing it down, but basically, we're narrowing it down to, whether I say Rav, he says, 5th century, but, we're getting closer. Okay. Now I'm going to mention an alternative view. There is a view that Aleinu was composed not for Rosh Hashanah, but elsewhere, and then borrowed into it. Okay. Now, an example of this view is Professor Meir Bar-Ilan in an article in the journal Da'at, volume 43. Okay, in general, I find Professor Meir Bar-Ilan to be very, very convincing, in general, but in this particular issue, he did not convince me. But, in general, I think he's very intuitive and brilliant. Okay, so what does he say? So an important thing to know in Aleinu research is there is a Aleinu text. There's a text of Aleinu in the singular it's called in Hechalot literature. What do I mean Aleinu in the singular? It's a text that goes Alai l'shabeach, Ani koreah. And so this is in Hechalot literature, but in this literature, it's a prayer said by Rabbi Akiva. When I say Rabbi Akiva, I mean pseudographic Rabbi Akiva. That I don't mean real Rabbi Akiva, but in this literature, they say Rabbi Akiva went to Shemayim, and then when he got back from his trip, he said Aleinu as a prayer of gratitude, but it's in the singular. Okay, so it's a prayer of gratitude in the singular on return from a trip to Shemayim. Okay, Alai l'shabeach, Ani koreah. So now, Professor Meir Bar-Ilan argues that there's two trends in liturgy issues. One is prayers that are in the singular or earlier than prayers in the plural, and the other is texts go from Hechalot literature into the regular liturgy rather than vice versa. So there are these two underlying trends, and then that lets him make the argument that Alai l'shabeach was the initial prayer in Hechalot literature, and that then it got into the plural in the regular liturgy. But as he realizes, the problem with this is that when you read this prayer, the Alai l'shabeach in this Rabbi Akiva going to Shemayim and coming back, it really doesn't fit the context at all. Okay, it's completely out of context there, and he realizes that. So then he has to come up with some other teretz, but basically, it's good to know that there is an Alai l'shabeach out there in Hechalot literature, but and it's hard to say that it originated in that story of Rabbi Akiva going to Shemayim and back. So now I'm going to show you, if you look at the way Al-Kain Nekava ends, how does Al-Kain Nekava ends? It has 4 melech words Okay, and you see it's a perfect intro to Malchiyos. Let me just read it. How does Aleinu Nekava end? Bikablu chulam et ol malchutecha. B'timloch aleim me'aral di'olam va'ed. Ki ha'malchut shelcha u'me'ad timloch bechavod. So that is how the Aleinu Nekava ends. So it's a perfect intro to Malchiyos with all those melech words there.
So you're saying really it's all about Malchiyos, which is why, in your opinion, it was originally composed for Rosh Hashanah as the introduction, in for Malchiyos.
Correct.
Right, and then it ends up in Shachris, which is what we've been discussing, and then it ends up in Mincha Maariv. Do you want to talk about the Mincha Maariv part now or later?
No, later. Yeah. Okay.
So we'll talk about the Mincha Maariv part shortly, but as you said, you mentioned the Malchiyos part at the end of Aleinu. But I wanted to mention, first of all, you mentioned the geniza earlier, and I mentioned, for those that aren't familiar with the geniza, I have some episodes on the geniza with Professor Eve Krokowski and Dr. Rebecca Jefferson. Probably it's come up in other instances, the famous geniza from Cairo and the many geniza fragments. We're not going to go into that in depth here. So you also, I think you alluded to this, you've done work on besides for, we just mentioned the Malchiyos part, on some of the other terminology and the words of Aleinu itself, where you already mentioned LeSaken, so you call it LeSaken, but let's call it LeSaken for Ashkenazi Avara, that LeSaken Olam, is it with a Chof, LeSaken, or with a Chof? Again, they're both LeSaken, but they have different meanings. So I'll let you speak about that. And also the beginning of Aleinu Nekava Hashem Aleinu Lirois Mehera B'Seferes Uzecha. So I'll let you. These are things that you've researched and looked into. So I'll turn that over to you.
Okay, thank you, Naki. Okay, great. First, I want to talk about the Tiferet Uzecha. Okay, so literally, it means glory and strength, but really, this really has to be looked at on a different level. And I'm going to tell you what the Abu Draham says. Okay, the Abu Draham says something, and he got it. Somebody else before him says it. Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar, who's a teacher of Ramban. And of course, what I'm going to say now is not in the art scroll. And when it's not in the art scroll, then no one knows about it. But you're going to see, I'm going to explain what this means, and it totally does not mean glory and strength. What it is this is a request for the rebuilding of the temple, but it's in poetic language. Okay, Tiferet Uzecha. For example, we all say Tehillim 96:6, Oz v'Tiferet b'Mikdasho. Okay, so. Oz and Tiferet are words that allude to the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, now I'm going to quickly mention some verses. Okay, and you could just write it down and look them up on your own. Tehillim 63:3, 78:61. There's also Yeshaya 67 and 64:10. Now, in the Zemer Tzor Mishalo, we say Zvul Beit Tifartenu, right? It's talking about the Beis HaMikdash. Tiferet is the Beis HaMikdash, and that Zemer is based on psukim. Okay, so another verse. This one I'm just going to read because this is really interesting. Eicha 2:1. We always hear this verse, okay, but we never think about it. So what does it say? How does verse 2:1 at the Eicha end? V'lo zachar hadom raglav b'yom po. God did not remember hadom raglav when he got angry. Hadom raglav, everyone agrees it's a reference to the temple, okay, his footstool. So what is the phrase before this? What's parallel to this in the verse? It's called Tiferet Yisrael. So Tiferet Yisrael is parallel to Hadom Raglav in this verse. So again, that's another. Tiferet Yisrael is a way to say the Beis HaMikdash. And even though it says Yishlich Mishmaim Aretz, that's just an exaggeration. You don't have to say that it's something that came literally from Shemayim. Okay, so basically, we have all these verses, and when you look at them carefully, you realize that Oz and Tiferet in this passage are really code words for the Beis HaMikdash. And you see, if you have any doubt with what I'm saying, what's the word before Tiferet Uzecha? It's Mehera. That's the perfect word that goes with the binyan of Beis HaMikdash. You see, what the author of Aleinu was doing is he's writing in lofty, elevated language. It's too boring for him to write Yibana Beis HaMikdash. Instead, he says, "L'ro Mehera Tiferet Uzecha." Okay, but of course, no one realized this, unfortunately. But again, it's in It's in the Ibud Raham and preceded by Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar. It's also in the Keter Shem Tov. But now you see, once you realize the pshat in this phrase, all of a sudden, this helps you date Aleinu. And now we see that the second paragraph is post 70. So now comes the important issue. What about the first paragraph? Did the two paragraphs have the same author? So basically, when you start looking at the verses, you see that the first paragraph cites from Yeshaya 45. That's Shehemish Tachavim. What's it? Mitpalim el Elo Yeshua. That's from Yeshaya 45. Mitpalim el Yeshua. And then the second paragraph has, Ki L'cha Techra Kol Berach Tishva Kol Shon, which is that's also from Yeshaya 45. They just changed a lead to L'cha. So we have two paragraphs that both cite from Yeshaya 45. And, again, the only reason for years people didn't realize this because the omitted line was not even printed. Like I think in the Birnbaum, etc. was not even printed. But now, when you look in the art scroll, they do print it. So we see that the first paragraph cites from Yeshaya 45. So does the second. And then you see Rabbi Jonathan Sachs writes, well, there are different authors to each paragraph, but they go well together. But the truth is, if they go together well, perhaps that means they had the same author. A prayer can have two different themes, meaning today this and in the future that. Like that's not a complex idea. So basically, once you realize that the two paragraphs go well together and they both cite from Yeshaya 45, the presumption should be that they were written by the same author. So basically, now, once you realize Lirot Mehirah B'Tiferes Zecha is post 70, then that suggests that the first paragraph was post 70 as well. Okay. Now I'm going to just go back to talking about LeSaken. So, the Chof. So I mentioned that, at the beginning, my friend Yechiel showed me his Teimani Siddur, which had LeSaken with a Chof, and I mentioned Rav Sadia. What about the Rambam? Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. You see, the Rambam did not say Daily Aleinu, but he said Rosh Hashanah Aleinu. And you could go to the Mishnah Torah, and there's a Nusach HaTfilah there. Okay, so what happens if you open up your standard Mishnah Torah, and you look at the Nusach HaTfilah? What do you see? Well, it has a v'chule there. It doesn't spell out all the words in Al-Kain Nekava. So everybody would ordinarily just assume he had the same, kuf reading like everybody else. But it turns out now when people do the research and print scholarly editions of the Rama's Mishnah Torah with a Nusach HaTfilah, they all print it with a kaf. Just like Rav Sadia had a kaf, the Rambam had a kaf. So, when I wrote this Chakira article in 2011, I cited the Rav Sadia and the Rambam, and 4 geniza fragments. But then I realized I needed to do more geniza research. So I had a certain professor, Uri Ehrlich, in Israel. He sent me. So basically, I ended up doing more research, and I revised my article and put it on Sfarim blog and in my Esther book. So that has much more geniza research. So how did I do this? So this professor, Uri Ehrlich, sent me a list of fragments of Aleinu from the Kara Geniza. Like gave me the fragment numbers of over 40 fragments. And, not all of them had the passages that I was interested in. But basically, once you had the fragment number, you could look at the passage. And, this is from the site Geniza.org. I'm using Geniza.org. I'm not getting my hands dirty. I don't have to wear a dust mask like Solomon Schechter, right? So there were 21 Geniza fragments which have the LeSaken phrase. 19 had it with a kuf. 1 had it with a kuf. And there was 1 which was just like a horizontal line, and I couldn't tell whether it was a kuf or a kuf. Okay, so basically we have the situation now where, the Siddur of Rav Sadia, Rav Sadia died in 942. The manuscript is not from 942; it's from 200 years later. Okay, so we have this situation where Rav Sadia and the Kara Geniza, those have a kuf, whereas European have a kuf. But I can't prove. I don't have a manuscript, from before 4,000 or anything, right? So I can't prove which one is earlier, right? So in other words, we have the geniza on one side, we have Machzor Vitri and everybody after him in Europe on the other side with a kuf. So you can't prove, which one is original, but tikkun with a kuf, tikkun ha'olam, is a common phrase in early rabbinic literature. It's 13 times in the Mishnah, it's many other times in rabbinic literature, tikkun ha'olam with a kuf. So we can understand how a kaf would evolve into a kuf, where you can't really understand how the kuf would evolve into a kuf. By the way, even with a kuf, a tough kuf nun means established. You could look it up in Jastrow, page 1692. So, and also it's even, one of the Sheva brachas, which is in the Gemara, hitkinlo mimeno binyan. So there also means established. So anyway, so even with the kuf meaning, it could easily mean established. But the point is that Aleinu, look, I'm sure the reading was with a kuf because again, the kuf would never go to a kuf. And so what is Aleinu? It's a Rosh Hashanah prayer. It's a prayer for establishing the world under God's sovereignty. That's what we're talking about. The context is a Rosh Hashanah prayer. Aleinu is it's not a social justice prayer. Aleinu is about a prayer for establishing the world under God's sovereignty. So the kuf meaning with establish, it makes perfect sense. I also have to mention that the Amram, the Seder of Amram, Amram lived 100 years before Rav Sadia, but the manuscripts of Rav Amram are very late, from the late Rishonim, so that they don't really play a part in our analysis here. Okay. Now, I have to mention a mistake that I made. Okay, I made a major error in my Aleinu article in my 2015 book and in my prior articles. So, what was my major error? By the way, if you buy the Esther book now, there's a correction page, which is added. So which tells you what my error was. Okay, so what was my error? Like everyone in America, I was brainwashed and thought that the Jewish people are the ones who are supposed to do the LeSaken, right? Tikkun Olam, I thought it was the Jewish people. But a few years ago, I realized it's really God who's supposed to do the LeSaken. So I once asked my friend Rabbi Benji Yadlak about this. He said, yeah, we say, Alkein nekaveh lecha. We're waiting for you, God. So now let me give you some more official sources on this one. We have Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in To Heal a Fractured World, page 76. What does Rabbi Sachs write? It is God, not us, who will perfect the world. Aleinu is not a call to action, but a prayer. Now, of course, he has the gear, so he assumes that it's with a kuf, but he says perfect the world. But basically, he realizes that it's God who's doing this and not the Jewish people. And then I'm going to cite Dr. Gerald Blitzstein's article in that famous volume, Tikkun Olam. So in his article, Tikkun Olam, it's on page 26, he says it is God who is expected and urged to bring it about. And then he says in the footnote, while it's slightly ambiguous, I think the phrase is correctly referring to divine activity. Okay, so I've quoted Rabbi Sachs, and Dr. Gerald Blitzstein, and they both agree that Aleinu was talking about something that God, that LeSaken Olam is something that God is supposed to do. So you understand, I spent years researching the issue of how to spell the word LeSaken, but with not enough time on who was doing it. But now at least I figured it all out, and now it's 1,700 years after the time of Rav. Let's say I think Rav was the original author of Aleinu. So 1,700 years later, we now know how to spell it, and we understand who's supposed to be doing it. Okay. And now I want to suggest an answer to the question I began this year with. Why was Aleinu introduced into the daily Shachrit in France in the 1100s? Now, personally, you have to realize that, before I give you my answer, I just wanted that there is a widely quoted answer by Professor Tashma. He has a suggestion, but he doesn't have enough sources for it. But whatever he says is widely quoted. But again, he's speculating, just like I'm speculating. But I'm not going to say what he says, okay? But you could read it anywhere. I mentioned it in my one of my books. Okay. So why was Aleinu introduced into the Shachrit in France in the 1100s? So you have to realize that Shehei Mishtachavim Lehevel Varik Umitpalim El El Lo Yashia. That is part of the original text, okay? That is part of the original text. So now I'm going to quote from something that I wrote in my Roots book. In my view, and in the view of many others, Aleinu was likely introduced into the daily Shachrit as a prayer meant to express a rejection of Christianity. Probably its introduction came as a response to the Crusades of 1096, or to the general feeling of downtroddenness that the Jews of France felt while living as second-class citizens in a Christian land. So again, the Jews are living as second-class citizens in a Christian land. They need an outlet to express their rejection of Christianity. So that this is my idea, and other people say this as well. And actually, if you want to read more about this, you can read an article by Ruth Langer in a book called The Experience of Jewish Liturgy, which is edited by Deborah Reed Blank. Okay, so if you want to read about, Aleinu as an anti-Christian prayer, in the 1200s, this is the article that you would read in The Experience of Jewish Liturgy, the article by Ruth Langer. Okay, so now I'm finally going to address the Mincha Maariv, but really we should say Maariv Mincha because.
Yeah, before you get to Mincha Maariv, I want to jump in.
Yeah.
And mention, you talk about the Christian part. I think you mentioned ArtScroll a couple of times. Not the, but I think so. I'm going to, listeners correct me if I'm wrong. I think they say it somewhere like it's purportedly against anti-Christian or whatever. But like you're saying, it's pretty clear. It seems like the consensus is that it was introduced Shemesh Dachevin part that they do have. It was anti-Christian.
Well, no, but when Rav wrote, if Rav wrote it, he wasn't addressing Christians because he wrote it. He lived in the 3rd century, so he was probably addressing idol worshippers of his time.
Right, and same if we go with the Rabbi Yehuda Chassid opinion that it was written by Yeshua, obviously. So you're saying it wouldn't be anti-Christian. So I just want to also point out, not to point out, like you mentioned that first of all, as you mentioned, I thought that you got too caught up in the LeSaken, Chof or Chof, but which is interesting. That's a lot. You write a lot about that, but also the standard in Siddurim is LeSaken, right? It's written with a Chof, like you said. When you see it with a Chof, that was a chiddush to you when you saw that originally.
No, well, the truth is, when I first saw it in Rav Sadia, it didn't register. But then when I saw it a few years later in the Yemenite Siddur, then all of a sudden it registered. Okay, so
got it. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so yeah, go on. So back to Mincha Maariv.
Right. Okay.
Mincha Maariv.
Okay, so here we have to rephrase our terminology. We have to say Maariv Mincha. Okay, so first of all, Aleinu at Mincha and Maariv is not in the Shulchan Aruch or the Ramah. Okay, that's our starting point. Okay, not in the Shulchan Aruch or Ramah. So basically, the earliest source from Maariv is the Kolbo, but the Kolbo is section 11, but he cites Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who was from Germany, who died in 1293. Okay, so the Kolbo cites, an earlier source, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, 1293, and the Orchos Chaim, which is a source related to the Kolbo, also, I believe, has the same citation. And we have an earlier source from Maariv, from Provence, a source called Minhag Marseille. Okay, so again, so we already have Aleinu in Maariv already. We're talking in the 1200s. Okay, so what happened here? You see, because Aleinu was seen as a parallel prayer to Shema. Okay, because Shema is Shem Echad, and Aleinu has Hu Elokeinu Ein Od. So that's how Aleinu got to be into Maariv, because it was seen as a parallel prayer to Shema, which is in Shachris and Maariv. But what about Mincha, where there's no Shema? So here, it's very interesting. We have a source in the early 13th century from Provence, which has Aleinu in the Mincha of Shabbos. So why would it make it into the Mincha of Shabbos? So if you think about it, the answer is because the Mincha of Shabbos starts Ata Echad. That's how that's the theme of the middle of the Shabbos Mincha Shmon Esrei. Okay, but I mean, basically for Mincha, some recited it and some didn't. It didn't really catch on. Okay, so and finally in the 16th century, someone asked the Radbaz, 16th century Egypt, someone asked the Radbaz, and the questioner said, some say it at Mincha, some don't. What should I do? So the Radbaz came up with an interesting idea. Okay, interesting logic. He says, precisely because there's no Shema at Mincha, we have to say it at Mincha, because if not, then we're leaving out that Yichud theme. Okay, so that this is a very interesting logic here, right? So, and as precisely because there's no Shema at Mincha, we need to get a Yichud idea into Mincha. So that was like the turning point. So from that point on, people began to say Aleinu at Mincha as well. So Aleinu, which was for hundreds of years seen as a yichud prayer parallel to Shema, slowly, it came to be seen as a 3 times a day prayer, and it also came to be seen as a concluding prayer. So, this is interesting because it started out as an introductory prayer, an introduction to the Malchiyos verses. So basically, on that note, I'm going to conclude this presentation, but I want to remind everybody they really need to buy Professor Kimmelman's book when it does come out, because, it's on all the daily liturgy, and, it's called The Rhetoric of the Jewish Liturgy. And everybody, you learn, he's been researching the tefillah, for many, many years, and he's collected it all in this book, and you'll all learn tremendous amounts from it. So Nachi, thank you so much for having me.
Sure, and Mitch, I would point out, so I've heard nice things about the book, but as you said, I think in Roots, you mentioned how it's forthcoming. You mentioned, and forthcoming 2019. We're in 2023 already, towards the end. So, hopefully. But as you mentioned, you have it. You have a long article on Aleinu and Esther Unmasked. You have it in your other books as well. There's some online links. So I'll link to your books. I think I did that first time. I'll link to your books. I will also link, if you have any of the articles available on Sfarim blog, send me the links. I'll put up the links in the podcast as well, that listeners can read these articles about Aleinu. So I'll link in the show's notes to that as well. And additionally,
but I
want to mention,
I just want to say the one on Sfarim blog, I think there's some format problem. So it's like it's there, but it's not. You got to buy my Esther Unmasked book, because the one on Sfarim blog, it's not paragraphed correctly anymore. All right.
So I'll try to link to, I'll search on Sfarim blog, Mitchell, first, but listeners can also see what comes up. But like you said, I'll link to the books, so definitely listeners can see that way. And I'm not going to link to Jewish History and Conflict, by the way. And listeners can Google it, but it's expensive and whatever. Well, one day I have to talk about that on a podcast episode, but for a different time. Also, I want to mention here that you write articles, you write in the Jewish Link, and you often write various articles which end up being, revised, expanded, whatever, collected in these books. And you do have an email list where you send it out. So listeners can get in touch. I'll put your email there, right? And they can get in touch with you, and they can be added to that email list if they're interested in receiving those weekly articles.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll do that as well. And, like you're coming out, that really, Aleinu was for Rosh Hashanah, which is coming up, really is introduction to Malchiyos. And it got moved after. So thank you, Mitchell, for coming on once again to talk about, your research into Aleinu. Very interesting. And hopefully the listeners found it interesting and enlightening. And like you said, we're free to disagree with you. You can read the articles, and you also summed up some other opinions here that you don't agree with. And there's a lot to talk about regarding Aleinu. So thank you again for joining me.
Okay, thank you, Nahi, for having me.